World War II started in 1939 in Europe, and the United States entered the war in 1941. As the name implies, it pitted most of the countries of the world against each other in the largest conflagration in human history. This war was considered a lot differently than some other wars. For instance, World War I, which many working people just saw as a battle of imperialist countries against each other for control of the world. World War II, on the other hand, was a war against the rise of fascism and Nazism, led by Germany, along with other countries like Italy. Because of the danger of fascism and Nazism to working people and to all people around the world, the war actually got a lot of support from working people in the United States, and there was not a lot of opposition to it. What we'll talk about in this unit that is beginning for the next 2 weeks, we'll be talking about the effects of the war, particularly on the home front, and also in the immediate aftermath of the war, what happened. One of the most important things that happened because of the support for the war, most unions in the United States took a no-strike pledge. Now, the no-strike pledge meant that workers would work and try to resolve grievances without resorting to strikes because they were supporting the war effort. On the other hand, there were some downsides to this pledge. Without the most powerful weapon that workers have, the right to withhold their labor, workers are in a pretty weak position in regard to their bosses. Because of this, the way that the no-strike pledge played out during the war was pretty uneven, and in some cases it worked out okay, but in a lot of cases workers were taken advantage of by companies. However, most unions did stick to the pledge and did not strike during the period of the war. Now, this will be important when we look at what happened right after the war was over and the no-strike pledge was no longer in effect. Some of the other important effects that we'll see were on new sources of labor. For the first time, for many of them, millions of women, African Americans, and other groups that had not been a full part of the American labor force came into the workforce and took on many of the important jobs in military establishments as well as other kinds of factories because so many people were abroad fighting in the war itself. Yeah. One of the other big effects was rationing. What this meant was that for all kinds of critical goods, from gas to cooking oil and on, the amount that everyone could purchase each week was limited. Everyone had ration books, and they would take these to their stores, and they could only buy a certain amount. And this was to spread around what was available to the civilian population, because so much of these materials were needed in the war effort itself. To implement all these changes, the government really took a much more active role in the economy. As we saw in the last unit, during the Great Depression and the New Deal, the government really took on a lot more responsibility for the economy, setting up many new agencies. Over the course of the Great Depression, the expenditures by the U.S. government fully doubled during that time. So compared to the beginning of the 1930s, by the end of the 1930s, the United States was spending twice as much investment in the economy in various ways. As large as that sounds, it really pales in comparison to what happened in World War II. In World War II, the expenditures by the government increased tenfold. So from twofold during the entire Great Depression to tenfold during World War II, we can see what a very large impact the government had in the economy. In addition to this much larger investment, the government also set up many new agencies: the War Production Board, the War Manpower Commission, the Office of Price Administration, and many others. In many ways, the United States economy approached a planned economy rather than the laissez-faire kind of economy in which businesses make all the decisions independently. During World War II, in order to change the economy to produce the goods that were needed for the war, the government really implemented to a large degree a planned economy, although with very active participation by big business. Our assignment for the first week of this unit will involve looking at transcripts from many people on the home front, from women on the home front, and in particular women who attended Rutgers during the war. And we can see from their lives, their testimonies of what happened during the war, what a big impact the war had on people at home, as well as people abroad. Now, once the war was over in 1945, there were another set of changes which occurred. To begin with, the no strike pledge was no longer in effect. Another very important event that happened was the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, who had led the United States through all the years of the New Deal and World War II, and he died just shortly before the end of the war. His successor, Harry Truman, was quite a bit different than FDR. He would become a cold warrior, one who helped transition the United States from a country entering peace after World War II into one that was almost on a war footing against the Soviet Union for many decades to come. One of the most important things that happened, and the primary topic of the second week in this module, will be the post-war strike wave. During World War II, American workers took a no-strike pledge not to strike during the time of the war. And not too many workers did strike, although there were some strikes in the United States. But because they didn't strike, there were many grievances that built up during the war. And by the end of the war, there were a lot of pent-up anger that workers had. Their pay had been outpaced by inflation, and grievances that they had, for instance, against an abusive foreman. They couldn't strike during the war. And so by the time that the war was over, there were workers ready to go back on strike again. And they went back on strike in a big way. Across the United States during 1945 and 1946, we see the largest strike wave in U.S. history. And many of those important strikes happened right here in New Jersey. Two of them happened right in Elizabeth, where I'm standing today. One of them behind me here, just past the bridge, was the factory of Phelps Dodge. The other one was at the Singer Sewing Machine Company a couple years later. Now, the Phelps Dodge strike was very significant for a number of reasons. First, the workers were members of the United Electrical Workers. This was one of the new CIO unions that was created during the 1930s. It was a real fighting union. It had an attitude of taking grievances strongly and dealing with them strongly. And although it had agreed to the no strike pledge during the war as well, when the war was over, it no longer felt bound by that, and it was responsible for many of the strikes that did occur after the war. In this strike, the company hired strike breakers. They were brought in on the river from New York, which is down there past the bridge. These strikers that were, these strike breakers that were brought in were accompanied by New York City police boats, and they were brought here to Phelps Dodge to work as strike breakers. Not only were strike breakers brought in, called scabs by the workers, but also the company hired goons that were affiliated with the organized crime organization known as Murder Incorporated. They also came by way of boats from Brooklyn, and they came and they engaged in all kinds of activities against the striking workers. In some cases, they actually fought pitched battles on boats. Some of the workers had boats as well. But in many other cases, these thugs would attack picket lines. When workers were walking up and down in front of the factory, the thugs would attack them with billy clubs, their fists, and in some cases guns. In one case, one of these goons shot and killed Mario Russo, a father of four. But the workers held out against all these odds, and after 270 days, they eventually won most of their demands, including a sizable wage increase. One of the tragic occurrences that happened at the end of this strike occurred when the famous folk singer Woody Guthrie, the author of This Land Is Your Land, he was playing here at a rally for the victorious strikers, and meanwhile, while he was performing, his 4-year-old daughter died in an apartment fire at their home in New York. But the workers did hold out for 270 days. They They won most of their demands, and that was the case in most of the strikes across the United States in 1945 and 1946. Phelps Dodge would be a company that would reappear in many other incidents in American labor history, but one of the most important events happened right here in Elizabeth, a city which, as you can hear from the background, is still a very active industrial area.